I swap the original yarn from a pattern at least 9 out of 10 times. Often it's just too expensive or it doesn't fit my vision of the final garment 100%, and I've gotten some questions about that, what I think about how I do it, and I thought today I'd do a video where I explain my thought process, what I try to keep in mind when choosing different yarn, when swapping out the original yarn, and I thought I'd also share some of my personal yarn favorites. So first we have to talk about the basics, or what I like to think about as basics when choosing yarn, and number one amongst those is that you have to know the original yarn. So when you choose a pattern and you realize that you're not going to want to knit it in the original yarn, you still have to look at the original yarn, because that's going to tell you a lot of information as to where to go from here. So you need to look at the weight of the yarn, the length of the yarn, and I also like to look at the fiber, because that can change a lot when it comes to the drape of the final garment. It can also change a bit when it comes to how fluffy or thick the yarn is, because different yarns behave a bit differently and different fibers behave a bit differently. So if you want your final piece to look as close to the original as possible, it's a really good idea to keep the fiber in mind. So for example, you find a sweater and the original yarn is Pergynt. That's a yarn that is 50 grams. It's 91 meters long, and it's also 100% Norwegian wool. And that would classify that yarn as kind of DK weight. It's a bit heavier than DK maybe, but usually what I do for swaps then is to find yarn in that same category, yarn that's around 100 meters long. Of course, I would suggest for all of this, when swapping yarn, you should always do a swatch just to make sure that you're kind of hitting the same gauge. If you watch a blog, that you can also kind of see how it will drape, but as a person that is way too impatient to do swatches, I have some swatches, but that's very rare, and I find that also when I do swatches, my gauge isn't the same when doing a tiny square as doing a whole garment. So I 100% understand if you don't want to do a gauge, but trying to find yarn that is the same fiber, same weight and same length is really important. Then you're kind of golden a lot of the time, at least as long as you find something that's close together. I usually personally, when swapping yarn out for Pergynt, I'll usually do Drops Lima or Drops Charisma. I find that those yarns are quite close. I have done some projects where I've actually done it once in Pergynt and then once in Lima, and I didn't find the differences that big. I think the one in Lima has more of a drape to it, because that is 35% alpaca and 65% wool instead of 100% wool, and I think that alpaca has a lot more drape to it. It is a lot more flowy, so that's something to think about. Again, fiber will change the drape, but I think that Pergynt is kind of a hard yarn to swap, because it's 91 meters and not a lot of other yarns are 91 meters, but choosing one that's 100 meters will be fine. But I try to, when the original is in Pergynt, I'll almost never swap for knitting it in some kind of merino wool, because I know that merino wool is a lot softer, it blooms more, it doesn't hold its shape as well, it pills more, and it's also just a lot softer. The drape will be very different. I still might do that if I want the sweater to look very different, but if I want the sweater that is the original sweater, I'll not make like huge swaps like that where I change the whole amount of fiber like it's 100% something else. Merino wool and 100% like wool, they're not really the same, even though both of them are wool. Especially if you choose something like superwash wool, you will get a very different end product. So that's why keeping fiber in mind is really important even though weight and length are definitely the important things when it comes to heat engage, fiber really determines your end product. And sometimes you'll also have some patterns where the original yarn comes in hanks, so that's usually 100 meters. And if you then want to swap it with a yarn that comes in 100 grams, and if you then want to swap it with yarn that comes in 50 grams skeins, you'll have to do some math. Usually it's just taking the meters and dividing them by 2, then you'll know how many meters there are per 50 grams. And then you'll just have to find something that lines up. So if it's 200 meters per 100 grams, it's 100 meters per 50 grams. Sometimes it's a bit harder because the numbers won't be as like easy to just divide, but if it's 100 gram skein, you just divide it by 2 and find something that correlates to that. Or if you want to do something else that comes in hanks, that's 100 grams, you just find something that's the same amount of meters. But you really have to make sure not every skein comes in the same amount of grams. So you have to look, is this a 25 gram skein? Is this a 50 gram skein? Is it a 100 gram skein? Is it a 150 gram skein? That's something you really have to keep an eye out for, because if not, it won't turn out the same. So I have some examples the way I would swap. So if a pattern says to me double Sunday by Sannes Garn, that's 100% merino wool, I would probably swap that for Drops Daisy, because both of those are merino wool and both of those are non-superwash, so those are really close to each other, but Daisy is half the price, I think, at least. If a pattern tells me Filcolana Peruvian, I think that's exactly 50 grams and 100 meters. Then I would do Lima. I might do Charisma, but Lima is really my favorite. But Charisma is another drops yarn that is 50 grams and 100 meters, and that's also superwash if you would want that. And then, for example, if it says Fritidsgarn, Sannes Fritidsgarn, I would choose Nepal. I've chosen Nepal for that in the past, but I really think that the most accurate swap would be to swap for Drops Alaska, because Fritidsgarn is 100% wool and Alaska is 100% wool, and both of them are non-superwash, whereas Nepal also has that 35% of alpaca, so that does change the drape a bit. Nepal is also a bit thinner, so you'll get a bit thinner sweater with a bit more drape. It's going to be a bit more loose. So that's kind of the really basic how to swap yarn. You have to look at weight and length and then keep fiber in mind, and that's kind of the recipe to change yarn. From there you can do whatever. This sweater I also swapped yarn for. This is the Porcelain sweater by Lene Holm Samsøe, originally knit in Tynn Pergynt and I think Sannes Garn Kid Silk. Almost all Kid Silk you can just swap in between them. They're the same, so you can swap from Drops Kid Silk to the soft silk mohair from Knitting for Olive. They're all interchangeable, so you don't have to think that much about that. There are some thick mohairs you'll have to keep an eye out for, but if it is 25 grams and around 200 meters, you're free to swap. And then for the Tynn Pergynt this is originally knit in, I think that's 200 meters or 210 meters or something. And I swapped into Drops Flora, which is also 210 meters per 50 grams. So those are the exact same, and I think this sweater came out really similar. Again, the Tynn Pergynt is 100% wool and the Flora is 65% wool and 35% alpaca. But since this is also mixed with mohair, I don't think it affected the drape that much. And if it affected the drape or affected anything, I just think it helped me even out my color work a lot. So I'm really happy with that swap. Of course, sometimes you're going to have swaps you're not as happy with, but a lot of the time I end up really happy with my swaps. I save money on it. I get a sweater that's quite close to how it was originally intended, as long as I keep fiber in mind. Sometimes I forget to do that and then it comes out very differently, but yeah, that is kind of it for the very basic. And then you also might want to change something in the pattern. You might want to take away mohair. I often want to take away mohair because I want to make more chill sweaters than I can wear more comfortably at home. But you might also want to add in mohair. Maybe you really like the look of that. Maybe you want halo for that sweater. And the kind of main rule for adding or taking away mohair is that you go up or down in yarn weight. So if the sweater is made in fingering weight yarn and mohair, if you want to not use mohair, you will want to go for a DK weight yarn. Also try to keep fiber in mind here, but it will of course change since one has mohair and one doesn't. Or if you have a sweater that's originally in just one strand of DK wool, you'll want to swap that into fingering plus mohair if you want to add mohair. Then of course you also have some sweaters that come in one strand of wool or one strand of something and then 2 strands of mohair. That changes things a bit, that makes it a bit more tricky to make those swaps. But usually I'll find, I think 2 strands of mohair is about 1 strand of fingering for me. So if it's DK plus 2 strands of fingering, I'll still do, no, plus 2 strands of kid silk, I'll do DK plus 1 strand of fingering. And that will give me about the same gauge, but it does get more tricky when there are multiple strands of mohair involved, and for that I would really recommend doing a gauge swatch because you don't really know how the new yarns will interact either. But that's kind of the basic and what I think about almost every time I swap yarn. And then there are also some more in-depth thoughts I have about who's the project for, the intended use, how often will I need to wash this, if I'm going to do superwash or non-superwash, but that's really depends. If you only knit for yourself, that makes it a bit easier to think about that. Maybe you just wear your sweaters, sometimes you won't have to wash them as much. It really depends on what you knit and how you use your knitwear, but I tend to do a lot of gifts, a lot of knits for kids, and sometimes I make sweaters like this that I just want to be pretty, and sometimes I knit sweaters that I want to be able to use outdoors and to really like use them. And I also have a toddler running around and he might make the sweater dirty instantly, so I often think about how easy is this going to be for me to wash, and then you kind of have to figure out, do you dare to wash it in the washing machine, no matter if it's superwash or not? How comfortable are you with washing your knits by hand, and how frequently are you willing to do that? That's also something to think about that will definitely affect what you choose to knit with. I would very often recommend doing superwash for kids, but I also find that superwash isn't as warm as wool is. So for mittens and hats and socks, I would really recommend to not do superwash because it just does not make them stay as warm as superwash does. I found that because I've made superwash mittens because I thought they will be so easy to clean, but we don't use them because he gets cold immediately. But I think superwash, especially for babies, superwash is great. And then for like sweaters and pants, superwash is still good because it's still wool, it still makes you stay warm, just not as warm as 100% non-treated wool would. And then I also think about my son. He does not care, he can wear whatever fiber, he doesn't find anything scratchy, so I don't have to keep that in mind for him. But for others' kids, I think about how much wool do they use in their day-to-day life. Have I seen them wear wool? If not, I'll probably go for the softest wool I know about. Definitely merino wool, oftentimes superwash, because that feels a bit softer. So it really depends on who you're making it for. Also, if yourself, do you find wool scratchy? There are a lot of ways to work around it. I know one tip is to place the yarn or to make a swatch and wear it on your neck. So if you were to make a swatch, you would kind of tuck it into your neckline here and wear it and see how that would affect you. I know for me as well, my neck is my most sensitive part. If my neck can handle it, every part of my body can. So I really recommend doing that if you're out shopping for yarn, to rub it on your neck, or if you're able to make a swatch, to put it in your neckline for a while to wear, so you know how you could handle the full garment. But that's more like personal questions you'll have to ask yourself, that I can't really tell you how to choose fibers that will not itch for you, or if you do gifts or not, I don't know. But my fiber choice really depends on who I'm making it for. For example, I won't choose to knit a lot with mohair for small babies or people that find wool itchy. I like to think about if it pills a lot or not when giving it away, because non-knitters might not have de-pillers. Also, do the people I gift this away to, do they know how to take care of something knitted? If not, I'm going to make it superwash. So that's something to think about. So my thought process when it comes to choosing yarn is, first I like to find the project, or it's about 50-50 if I figure out who I'm going to knit for or the project first. But I either figure out who, so if is it a gift knit, is it for me, is it for my son, is it for my fiance, and the project, sweater, pants, socks, mittens, hats, and then I look at the yarn in the pattern and figure out how expensive that yarn is. Most of the time too expensive for me, so I want to swap it out. And then I look at the original yarn, see the fiber, see the weight, and I've been knitting for so long now that I have some very clear favorites. So I'll always choose Lima if Lima is an option. Lima is one of my favorite yarns. I love working with it. I love the colors in it. I love the fiber makeup of it. It's 65% wool, 35% alpaca. I love that it's non-superwash, so I can split splice the ends. But of course that's personal preference, that has come from years of knitting, years of trial and error. But for me now, I have done so much trial and error that I kind of immediately know what yarn to swap for. If I see something is 100 meters, it's going to be Lima. If I see something is 200 meters, it's going to be Flora. If I'm knitting fingering weight baby knits, it's going to be Drops Baby Merino. If I'm gift knitting a DK weight child sweater, it's going to be Merino extra fine. If I want to make a more woolly gift knit, it's going to be Charisma. If I'm making something chunky, it's going to be Nepal or Alaska. So I just have those like go-to yarns that I can just grab and go. But that's something that comes with time and figuring out what works for you. But I would really recommend Drops yarns. Personally, I know there is a bit of controversy around that and the ethical and how ethical it is, but I really enjoy Drops yarn. They have a really good price range. They have so many different yarns, and honestly, even if it's more of a budget yarn, I have had almost no problem with Drops yarns. They are always great. I don't find that many knots in my yarn, and when I knit with Sannes garn, because I have done that sometimes, I've found way more knots in my yarns or irregularities throughout my skein. So even if Drops is a budget yarn, it really doesn't feel like a budget yarn when knitting with it, and it's also a great way into knitting. Even if you will want to like graduate into more expensive yarns down the line, it's a great way to get to try so many different fibers without blowing all of your money, so you can figure out your favorites and where to go from there, even if once you've figured out your favorites you'll want to continue knitting with Knitting for Olive or Filcolana or Sandnesgarn or Raumagarn, whatever you want to knit with afterwards. It's a really nice starting point because they do have so many different fibers without breaking the bank. And then lastly, I thought I'd just say my favorite yarns. All of these are from Drops because that is where I end up buying my yarn from almost all of the time. And I have kind of ranked these, but it got really hard to rank after like number 4. So after number 4, they're kind of all 5th place, but these are my favorite yarns. So of course at the top we have Lima. That is for me the most versatile yarn that I get to use for the most amount of like different projects. And then after that we have Flora, which is also really versatile, and then we have Nepal. All of those 3 yarn types are also kind of the same, just in different yarn weights, because all of them are 65% wool and 35% alpaca, and I really like that fiber combination, probably why it's my favorite. And then in 4th place we have a quite new to me yarn, and that is Drops Alaska. I've knit with that only once, but I loved the whole experience of working with that, knitting with that, so that has climbed really high really quickly. And then in 5th place we have Kid Silk. I don't love wearing Kid Silk all of the time, but Kid Silk is super versatile and it's always great when working with it, even though I don't want it with all of my sweaters. Then we have Daisy in 6th place. It's great yarn, super soft, love it, but it does pill a lot. But I've also noticed that for me it pills a lot, but I've also made a sweater for my son in it, and he has worn that sweater a ton. It's his most used sweater in the last few weeks or months now, and his sweater has like 3 pills on it, so it really depends on the person too. So that's why this is quite high for me, even though it pills a lot for me, because I don't think it pills that much for everyone. In 7th place we have Baby Merino. It's not my favorite because it is superwash and that means more ends for me to weave in, but it is a great yarn for baby knits and I love baby knits, so I knit a lot with Baby Merino. Same for Merino Extra Fine, though I use that more for a bit bigger kits that I knit more in DK weight for. Still a great yarn. It's not my personal favorite, but for gifts it's amazing. Then we also have Charisma, also not my favorite, but for gifts it's amazing, and for some certain sweaters that is the best yarn. And then in 10th place, that should really be higher, is Drops Puna, which is 100% alpaca yarn. That is just amazing. I love it. I wish I would knit more in it, but it's in a bit of an in-between place. It's 120 meters per 50 grams, so it's just a lot thinner than a lot of DK weight yarn, so it's not the easiest yarn to swap. But I really hope I'll be able to knit more in that the next year. But I hope that helped some, that you'll find it a bit easier to swap yarn now. Feel free to ask me questions in the comments if I need to clear some things up, but this are kind of the things I think about when I choose yarn for my knitting projects, and also some of my favorite yarns. And I hope you found it helpful. If you did, please leave a like and a comment. That means the world to me. And if you want to see more from me, please subscribe. Bye!